This year we are off again to hopefully an impressive start. We have tonight's session, which is devoted to the Pontic Greeks. And I should say that next month, on March 21st, Nicholas Gage, who is a board member, will discuss being an investigative reporter and an author, and describe what really is an extremely accomplished career. Tonight is the Pontian Odyssey, and I will ask Robert Shaw, who's vice chairman and a board member, to introduce tonight's guests. I also want to thank Robert for the inspiration for this session, for putting it together, which I'm sure will be a fantastic and enlightening evening. Robert?
Well, first I should thank you all for being here on this cold winter night. I hope you'll find it to be an interesting evening. And I'd like to thank His Grace, Bishop Andronios, and the Consuls General of Cyprus and Greece for also joining us. I'm not the inspiration. The inspiration really is Tom DeWall, who is, as you will see on the program, a senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. Tom studied modern Greek and Russian at Oxford, and he is an authority on the geopolitics and history of the Caucasus. And I heard Tom speak on the Caucasus one morning at the Carnegie Council here in New York, and bought his book on the Caucasus. And in looking at the book, I saw he had a section on the Greeks of Abkhazia in Georgia, who are Pontic Greeks, the community there, and how it was dispersed and how eventually it came to Greece in the early 1990s. And Tom very kindly agreed not only to speak to us, but also suggested that we speak to Nikolaos Michailidis and to Ted Cosmos, who are also here tonight and who really are, I think, going to contribute to this program being very rich and interesting. We will begin with Tom, and then we will listen to Nikos, who will speak to us on some very interesting, I think, cultural and anthropological issues, and also will give us a demonstration of the lyre, which I gather he's a very proficient player of. And finally, Ted, or Eleftherios, will show us some of his photographs. So I will ask Tom to begin. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Let me just, as I'm sure if there's a question, this question usually comes up, so I will answer it myself before I'm asked. Tell you a little about my background, why someone with a British accent and a Dutch name should be standing in front of you this evening. Actually, let me first of all just also thank not only Robert, but the Hellenic American Cultural Foundation and the Diocese for hosting us this evening. It's not very often that you get an opportunity to talk about the Pontic Greeks. I do think they're fascinating people with a fascinating story who deserve to be better known. As Robert said, I studied modern Greek and Russian at university in England. I like to think of it as studying one cold language and one warm language, that after a winter in Moscow I could go out to Greece and get a bit of sun. There's an interesting crossover, obviously, between Russia and Greece, the two Orthodox nations, not least of which is the way that the Pontic Greeks, many of them fled to Russia. So when I came to work in Russia and the Caucasus as a journalist in the 1990s, I was naturally, as someone who's also spent time in Greece and studied Greek, interested to meet the Greeks. They were called Grieki in Russian, but then I rapidly realized that they weren't like other Greeks. They were a bit more different, and they had this extraordinarily interesting history, tragic history, and a very interesting culture. I made a program back in 1992 for the BBC about the Greeks of Russia and the Caucasus. And so ever since then, this has been a subject that has fascinated me. And I think there are three recurring themes when we talk about the Pontic Greeks. One of them is diaspora, the scattering. And it's hard to think of a people who are more scattered than the Pontic Greeks. Another one is tragedy, and they've had a very tragic history. And the third is music. Wherever you find more than about 3 or 4 Pontic Greeks in a room, sooner or later you get some music. And to start with the diaspora and the tragedy, I mean, I think most people here know the basics of the story, that this is Greeks of the Black Sea, from the Pontus region around Trebizond, that incredibly beautiful land with those valleys coming down from the Black Sea, and how they've lived there for most of recorded history, and how in 1923, under the Treaty of Lausanne, 1 million Greeks were deported from Turkey to Greece, and 500,000 Muslims were deported to Turkey the other direction. And so that was suddenly the abrupt and tragic end for the Pontus as a Greek homeland, but the beginning of an extraordinary story of diaspora. And many of them, of course, went to Greece, a country that I think they found rather shabby and second-rate, some of them, after the beauties of the Pontus. I still hear a hint of snobbishness about some Pontians, the way that they compare places they've been to the place they came from, which is obviously the most beautiful place in the world, the Pontus. And then some of them also went to Russia and the Caucasus, where, unfortunately, they then suffered further deportation and exile in the 1940s, when Stalin started deporting whole nationalities on the grounds that they were not loyal nationalities, and deportation by whole ethnic group, whether that be Crimean Tatars, or Turks who were thought to be associated with Turkey, whether it be Kurds, Germans, Koreans, and then all sorts of nationalities, Chechens, English, and Pontic Greeks as well, who were deemed to be enemy agents of Greece. So in the 1940s, a further exile and scattering of the Pontic Greeks, this time to the wastes of Kazakhstan. And let me tell you about a few of the Pontic Greeks I came to know in my searches. Well, the first was an amazing man called Nikolaos Michailidis, who I think embodies a kind of all of these stories of diaspora, tragedy, and music. He was a player of the Kemenje, of the lira. It's the first time in his Moscow apartment he got out the instrument and started playing it in his Moscow apartment. He had been born in Georgia, then he grew up in Baku on the Caspian Sea, where in the 20s there was still a Greek newspaper, a Greek football team, a Greek church, 20s and 30s. And then in the 1940s, just as he was starting his college education, all the Greeks were deported to Kazakhstan. He then made his way back illegally to Baku, and in 1949 he was deported again. So he worked on a collective farm, he did all sorts of things. And it was only about 15 years after he'd started that he finally finished his musical education. But he was joked with me how, it was an interesting education. I would never have learned to drive a combine harvester if it wasn't for Stalin. He then worked in Ukraine and then ended up in Moscow, where he was a music teacher. And one of the things he finally did when he settled down was to write down all the tunes of all the Pontic songs that he remembered from his youth, from memory. One of which he played to me on his lyre in his Moscow apartment, which went Anathema to Kazakhstan, Kursk beat Kazakhstan. He played that to me. But the kind of fusion of those stories of music and tragedy, he told me a story about how all the way Stalin deported people would be swept up in literally 24 hours. They would be given 1 or 2 hours, or even less sometimes, to take a couple of bags. If you're leaving your home, you're being sent to God knows where in exile, and then they'd be shoved into these cattle trucks, these trains, and then set off on a journey of days and weeks to Central Asia. And suddenly all the Greeks of Baku were swept up one night. And he described into the journey, they didn't even know where they were. A couple of days into the journey, they arrived at some station and the train stopped in the middle of nowhere. And suddenly on the other side of the platform, another train stopped. And they started calling to each other, and they realized this is another train of Greeks being deported from someone else. And he said someone had a lyre and someone had a this and a that, and the guards were a bit sleepy, so people started stepping out on the platform. And before you knew where you were, there was dancing, there was singing, they were playing the lyre, and dancing the Kaminjay, and then suddenly, half an hour later, the whistles went, the guards bundled everyone back in their trains, and they were sent off into exile again. And then Abkhazia on the Black Sea, which is another beautiful place, not so far from the Pontus, also a tobacco growing area. Greeks were deported from there, or went willingly there in the 19th century. They were very rich Greeks, and when I went there in 1992, in the spring of 1992, wandered around this lovely Black Sea town with all these villas. People pointed out to me, and that's Aloisi's house, and Aloisi turned out to be the Greek tobacco and shipping magnate of Sukhumi, the town where I was. And it turned out the Greeks of Abkhazia were a very significant community. That was May of 1992. There was already a lot of tension in Abkhazia. And there I made a new Pontic Greek friend. He was the local archivist, the head of the archive, a man called Nikolaos Michailidis. And he filled me in a lot more about the story of the Pontic Greeks. He himself had written a book about the Greeks of Abkhazia. And in 1949, the Greeks of Abkhazia were deported en masse by Stalin. Nikolai was lucky because his mother was German and managed to convince them that her son was German too, but so he wasn't deported. But he then, as head of the archive, he researched the story. He got all the information from the KGB archives about what had happened to the Greeks of Abkhazia. And he described them as a community where there was a lot of tension between the Georgians and the Abkhaz who held things together in Abkhazia. But his story, I'm afraid, also gets tragic. That was May of 1992. In August of 1992, war broke out between the Abkhaz and the Georgians. And in October of 1992, the Georgian paramilitary detachment surrounded the archive, pushed away the neighbours, put gasoline on the ground and set fire to the archive of Abkhazia as a deliberate attempt to destroy the culture of their enemies, the Abkhaz. And 95% of that archive was destroyed. So Nikolaos Michailidis gathered up what was left, about 5% of it, and kept it in his apartment all through the war. So he was the man who preserved the remnants of that culture through the war. And when I caught up with him a few years later, he got a building back, and he was still trying to kind of piece together bits of that archive. Eventually he gave me a manuscript, the full manuscript of his book of the Greeks of Abkhazia, and I hope that book will be coming out in Greek and Russian sometime this year. So that was another extraordinary story of a Pontic Greek. And then in 2009, I finally made it to Panayasumalan. Panayasumalan, as you all know, is the kind of Holy Mother Church of the Pontians. This incredible, you go up from Trebizond, up through the valleys, and then the gorge gets narrower and narrower. The wind is blowing, just as it is with us, and then you look up, and possibly high, kind of like a beehive hanging from a cliff, is this extraordinary monastery And so that was a very exciting experience. But I deliberately I was making another program for the BBC on August 15th, the Feast of the Panagia, the Feast of the Virgin. And this was an extraordinary experience because over the last few years, Turkey, as we know, has started to open up. And the Pontians have started to come back. And there were people there literally from all over the world, from Australia, from Virginia, obviously lots and lots from Greece, and lots from Russia. This wonderful mixing of the languages. One moment you'd hear an American accent, next moment Russian, next moment Greek. Everyone swarming up the hill to Panagia Sumala. And this is where I met these two gentlemen, Elias Neofytides, the photographer who was there snapping away, and Nikos, the musician, with his Turkish friend, Edem, and they were playing together. And that made for a fascinating experience. And then they took me off into the hills, and it got even more extraordinary because the hills behind Trabzon, you go up and up into the mountains. It gets colder and colder. This was August, but we were shivering. The fog had come down. And there was a festival up there where they were dancing the Pontian dances. The women were wearing headscarves, but the music was absolutely Pontian. People were Muslim, and yet when you heard them talk to each other, they were talking Greek, and not only Greek, but the Greek that was more familiar to me in a way from the Greek I'd learned at school when I did ancient Greek. They would say, "Ooh, fellow, I don't want," instead of "then fellow," with a more archaic form. And so that was another extraordinary experience. That they're actually, what happened in 1923 was that people were deported on the basis of religion, not on the basis of language, which meant that you had Turkish-speaking Christians ending up in Georgia and Saloniki, and you had Greek-speaking Muslims being left behind. Clearly, the Greek-speaking Muslims had authentic Greek ancestry. They just converted to Islam at some point in the late Ottoman period. So I think the Pontic Greeks have a lot to teach us about survival in the 20th century, about the survival of a culture. And I think there are three things I would really take away from my encounters with the Pontic Greeks. I'm sure there'll be many more. One is this extraordinary musical culture. It's sort of, I've never seen how quickly a group of people can immediately start dancing and start and get down to music. This is obviously, it's not in, one can't say it's in the genes, but it's in the culture. And that's a terribly exhilarating thing to be witness to. The second thing is that it expands the idea of what it means to be Greek. We normally associate Greek to be associated with the country of Greece. But in fact, Greekness is bigger than that, and we don't really have a proper word for it in English, because these people didn't, only at the end of the 19th century did they start calling themselves Greek or Hellenic. Before that, they would call themselves Romei, they would call themselves Romans, because they were the Byzantines. I mean, their Byzantine rule ended there in 1461, but for them that was just a blink of an eye ago. And they still call themselves Romans. And of course they were sent to live in Greece, and many of them have made good lives in Greece. But they had no association with the state of Greece before they were sent to live there. So Greekness is bigger than Greece itself. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. The Pontics expand our idea of what it means to be Greek. We don't really have the language for it in English. And thirdly, I think that they also form a bridge to different cultures, because this is a very rich culture which was surrounded by Muslims, surrounded by the Ottoman Empire. And so to be Pontic is more than just to be Greek, because there are those Muslims up there in the hills who speak Greek, who are pretty much authentically Pontic. They speak the language. all that they don't have is the sort of is the religion and the formal association with Greece. So I think there are many, as Turkey opens up, and hopefully it will open up a bit more, those people hopefully will get some legitimacy. And you can't really call them Greek, but you can't really call them fully Turkish either. They have to be called Pontic. So there's a whole culture there which hopefully those people are preserving and the people in exile are preserving in different ways. And it's very exciting to see how they come together. As Nikos and Edem came together, that they made a couple of CDs together. And I don't think they think of themselves, well, you can ask Nikos himself, I'll tell you whether they think of themselves as Greek and Turkish. I think they probably just think of themselves as musicians and Pontic. But I don't want to impose any definitions. He's the anthropologist, he can tell you. But I think that's also very exciting that there's a little culture there, which now hopefully, slowly, is becoming a bit more legitimate, a bit more permitted as the Turkish state opens up. So hopefully the tragedy is mostly over, the diaspora continues, and the music certainly continues of the Pontic Greeks.
Does this work? Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom. I think what we'll do is proceed with the program. Nikolaos Michailidis will speak next. Oh, sorry, Ted will speak next, yeah. And then Nikolaos will speak. And then there'll be an opportunity at the end for anyone to ask questions if you'd like to. And the Lyra will also speak. Yeah.
There are some technical difficulties, so I'm going to be working directly by the LCD projector, so give me a moment to set up. I hope you'll bear with me. The presentation I was working on seems to be running on its own, so I'll try and keep up with it. First, let me thank Robert Shaw and the Hellenic American Cultural Foundation for having me out this evening. I'm going to be showing a series of photographs. They are 20 years of my work documenting Pontian culture. They are of a personal nature, and I'm going to just jump right in to this picture and hope that it stays there for a few seconds. In 1994, I began this journey and traveled to Greece to visit some family and to take care of some family business. And first picture is from Banaya Sumela, which you heard Tom talking about. This particular place is actually in Greece, and it was built. Yeah, I'm not sure how to work this one.
Get out of the slideshow. Yeah, you should show them like one. Yeah, picture mine, then advance it with the arrow. Maximize it. You can advance it with the arrow.
Maximize.
Maximize and advance with the arrow. There you go.
That's what we're going to have. Okay.
Yeah, the top. Right, between the X. No. Between the X and the dash. Click right.
With the red X, go to the left.
It had been 28 years that had passed. So for me, Greece was essentially brand new. I'd never gone back, and I went back to see some family and friends. Two extraordinary things happened to me during that summer. I found my family home, and I heard this story from some of the people that lived around there of our odyssey, our human odyssey of getting to America, which our family took from the Pontus region, but did not go west to Greece. We essentially went east into Russia and then subsequently in 1940 my family came to Greece, and then in 65 we came to the United States, and that's where my journey begins. So that particular event, and then visiting this particular monastery in Western Greece, which is built in memory essentially of the original facility in Trabzon, Turkey, I wanted to see and I wanted to find more about. So when I got there, like Tom said, you found people speaking Pontian, but you also found people speaking many different languages. And this particular image I caught while I was walking through the crowds, and you have this woman reaching up with her hand to touch the icon. Now the icon, historically, I think was painted by the evangelist Luke, and over the course of time it ended up in Trabzon, Turkey, at Bani Yasumala, and then returned here to where the Pontian community created this facility where it is housed today. So this is one of the images that I shot early on as I started to document Pontian culture. Another image from the same place. As you can see, it's you're capturing this young lady's gaze, and they're dressed in very formal Pontian clothing, preparing to dance. Another image capturing men dressed in traditional Pontian clothing. And the lighting here was just extraordinary, just the way it kind of caught all the daggers and the hands, and the pageantry of it was really neat. Okay, so after I'd returned back to the States that summer in '94, I did a lot of research, and I wanted to really find out more about the culture and the history. But as I examined all of it, I didn't find a lot of contemporary visual documentary work. There just wasn't much in the West. So I was also doing some reading about the fall of communism and how a lot of Pontians were being brought into Greece. And so that summer I decided that I would go to a refugee village. And this is outside of Kavala in the small village called Nazilon. What you have here are a series of makeshift homes that were built by the Greek government. And what's interesting here is there's a young boy standing by the crate to the left, and you can see exactly where this family came from. So Almaty, I believe, is in Kazakhstan today. So you can get an idea of where this family came, how this crate essentially was their entire life. They came with this crate. I met this family. I stayed with them for a couple of days. And then the other interesting part of this, which you really can't see that's very dark, is when I got there, the woman that's sitting in the chair was reading the Bible. And you can kind of make out the cross on it, but she was reciting some stuff from the Bible. And people just spent a lot of their daily time sitting around. There wasn't much to do. The water lines still weren't put into this village. So it was really a rough area. What we have here is an image of contrast. You have a young boy showing his gymnastic skills, so to say. And what's interesting about it was all these children in the village were vying for my attention as I walked through. But as I was saying, what's really interesting about this image is the temporary church. It looks like some kind of a military, I forget what they call it. A bunker of some sort. So this church was built for the refugees that were resettled there in Nazilon. I came back there a few years later, and it was gone. And they hadn't replaced it with an actual church. I don't know what actually happened to it, but the other extraordinary thing that happened to me when I was traveling through this village, by the end of the second day, the children had somehow started to walk around the village with me as I started to photograph them, and they started picking wildflowers and covering me and my photo vest with wildflowers. And I specifically remember at the end of the afternoon stopping at one end of the village and looking back at these kids and saying, wow, this could be my story. My family essentially went through something similar, except they came at a different stage. They came in 1940. These people came in 1991, 92. I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about every single image here, but back in the Pontus region, you have a lot of people that like to go into the mountains, or as they say in Greek, into the Barhad region. So when I was in Kozani, Greece, I was with a friend who we were talking about all of this lifestyle, and he said that a lot of these traditions still go on today, and he said, if you'd like to, I can take you to a place where a lot of people still live in the mountains. And so what we did is we traveled this road into the mountains, and we met up with a series of women that were milking cows, and and they had come out and they invited us to eat with them and have a few drinks. Unfortunately, I don't drink that much, and they drank a lot, so the evening went on, and I finally bowed out after shooting a couple pictures. Now we're in Philadelphia here. What I love about this image is, of course, there's this wonderful line, and Independence Day celebrated by Greeks all over the States. What I usually see when I go to a parade are Scottish bagpipes, so for me, seeing something like this was extraordinary. I think it's called a tulum. Somebody want to jump in and give me the correct word? But it's essentially the same concept, except this is what Pontians use, and there are different cultures that use the same idea when they play these things that are similar to a bagpipe. But in Pontian culture, this is very traditional historically. Why I love this image? Well, there's two great expressions here. The woman in the foreground is having a great time, and the man in the background is very prideful. They're Pontians, and they're riding to catch up to us at the front of the parade. And what made it feel very Greek was the scooter. You generally don't see people riding around in scooters in Philadelphia. You see motorcycles. So this really gave me a very Greek feel. This is in a Pontian clubhouse here in Philadelphia. In clubhouses all over North America, the Pontian clubhouses, you have these events called muhabbets. I think it's an Arabic term that identifies social gatherings. The traditional historic term is called barakat, from what I've heard. So what you have is when a musician comes in to your community, they have this social gathering at the local clubhouse. It usually starts late in the evening. It's generally adults and some young people. Sometimes you'll see something like this where they bring their kids. I thought it made kind of a funny picture of these two young boys sleeping in the clubhouse, and you can't see it right there, but to the right the musicians are playing and they're having a real good time, and it's probably 2 o'clock in the morning. This is in Boston, Massachusetts at about 4 a.m. We've got two musicians on the right. You can't see the microphone on the right hand of the second musician, but they were essentially singing, and this is what one of the party scenes looked like late into the evening, this traditional event called a muhabbet. I think it's a really great moment. It's very decisive. You have the one gentleman to the left looking off into the crowd, but you can't see who they're looking at, and then the smoke, and the gentleman to the far left is kind of, I think he's wondering, what are you going to sing? And what I did is here, I wanted to show this image. Now this is in New York at the local Pontian clubhouse, again with the theme of a muhabbet. And what I wanted to do is show this particular musician. He's got the microphone in one hand, the cigar in the other hand, and a pile of money starting to stack up. And every once in a while they come out and sweep it. This is relatively early in the evening. He's having a great time. But here, he's not having such a great time. He's actually very reflective, and I thought this made a real interesting contrast between the two images. This is shot in New York at about 4 o'clock it's shot in Boston at a muhabbet, a social gathering, at about 4 o'clock in the morning. So the same musician, two contrasting images, and obviously two different emotions going through this situation. Maybe he's unhappy about the money. Okay, so here in the States, we have a place, as you can see the top upper left-hand corner, it's called Bani-Yusumela. The original monastery, as you heard earlier, is in Trabzon, Greece. There are 3 other monasteries globally that are named in honor of the original facility. One is in Melbourne, Australia. The other one is between Kozani and Veria in Greece, where I showed you the first picture. And this one is here in West Milford, New Jersey. What I love about this particular image is if you get to an event early enough, or if you go covering something like this, you get something different. It's not a traditional picture. You have these women stringing together wildflowers, and they're taking direction from the woman on the far right. So what you get is something just untraditional, and it captures how dedicated people really are to coming out and supporting this particular facility. And of course, here's the tradition that happens on August the 15th. At that facility, they have an assortment of events they host there every year. They're carrying the icon around, as you can see. It goes around the church, and they bring it in for services afterwards. This is in Philadelphia, in the suburbs. It's sort of the home of the Pontian community there in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. It's right outside of West Philadelphia. And what you have here is a Memorial Day service showing the community gathering. And this is one of two monuments that are in North America dedicated to those lost to genocide and the loss of the homeland. The other one I think is in Toronto, if I'm correct, in Canada. So this is in honor of the lost victims. Okay, and this is at the same event. This is. Oops. Yeah. Oops, too far. Okay. So this is at the same event, and what I did here is I wanted to frame this wonderful set of hands in the foreground reaching for bread. And then you have another set of hands, again, they're reaching for bread in a very pensive moment taking place as the icons brought over at the end of service.
It's Father Nectarios from Upper Darby, St.
Yeah,
Nicholas.
you got that right, yes. So the last few years, there's been a movement in North America to organize these giant festivals or weekend, I don't want to call them retreats, but they're essentially, they brings together all the Pontian communities from around North America. And this year, actually, it's going to be hosted in New York City. The importance of this image was that this is the first time, I think, in quite a few years that I've ever heard, all the Pontian organizations came together, and this is in Atlanta, Georgia, and they came together for a dance on Sunday afternoon. And in honor and in memory of their loved ones, that they performed some theatrical acts. And this one, you have a woman embracing the soil of her homeland. I thought it was very captivating, so I thought I'd add it to the presentation. I apologize that it's come in this way. Okay, I'm going to take you over to Turkey now. When people go into the Pontus region, they generally go to see the architecture, the historical churches. Obviously, when you look at this image, you see a young Muslim girl in the foreground, but there's something here that's really important that I think most people don't see when they come into the town. This is in the medieval part of the city, and there's a cobblestone road, and in the background there is a giant lira, or kemençe as they call it in Turkish. So I wanted to frame out this girl who was waiting, and this kemençe, just to show that there's this intense love of music that's remained there and continues to grow. Again, as I was saying, most people go into the historical churches and some of the architecture. I heard about a small area just east of Trabzon where many Greek merchants had lived, and it was called historically Vlatana, and it was up on a hill. And my driver, I had read about it, I told my driver to take me to this area, and as we were driving around the hills, we noticed the architecture, some of the Greek writing on the walls and some of the buildings. But at one point when we started to descend the hill, and you could see the Black Sea in the distance, I saw a small boy running up the side of a hill with this paper-made kite, and I started to run with him, and I started to frame the picture. To me, it represents a nostalgic view of this part of the city. And of course, if anyone wants to really see the real life that Pontian people and the traditions are being kept, you have to go into the mountains. So this is a shot of how plush green it is back behind the major part of the city. And here you have two women trying to wind their way through the hill to come up to the main road where there was a street bazaar. And again, the further into the interior you go, as Tom said earlier, there's a lot of fog, but people seem to know their way around. I mean, they spend 4, 5, 6 months at a time, sometimes up there, maybe longer. But I know that in the spring, people are definitively back in the mountains and living amongst nature. And of course, as we ascend into the mountains, we find these trails that only the drivers know, or people that are from the region know, and you find scenes like this where you have children standing on the side of the road, and they're selling wildflowers. You find it all over the region, but what made this real interesting to me was, of course, this vibrant colored flower. I never found the technical name for it, but the Greeks called this Panagio's Dodakri, which I believe literally translates to the Virgin's tear. So driving around, I saw these children, and wherever I went, I actually saw them. And this really leads me to this. 4 or 5 months of the year, it's festival season. You can go just about anywhere in the Pontus region, especially in the Trabzon area, and you'll see these type of events taking place. This particular image, I believe, pretty much captures the essence of everything. You have the musicians in the foreground, and you have this wonderful moment where the musician playing the daul, I think it's called, the dauli, he's got money in his mouth, and what happened was somebody had put a drink in front of him on the ground. He walked up, drank it, and the money was there, and he grabbed the money with his mouth, and they started to circle, and as they circled, they circled right in front of me, so I've got this frame where they're coming right into the camera, and then you have this group of people dancing, but there's literally hundreds of them. And in the background you can see a mosque, and a few seconds later, as you can see at the top of the screen, the fog is rolling in, and literally 10, 15 feet in front of me, you saw nothing afterwards. I mean, it just disappeared. It was really incredible. By the way, this particular place that I'm at is called Kadirka. It's the biggest festival of the year, and it's held the 3rd weekend of July. And if anybody knows the 3rd weekend or the 3rd Sunday in July, there's a celebration, a religious celebration, the Prophetito Elia. If everyone's familiar with that, it's a consistent event that happens every year that particular weekend. And still here at Kadirka. Now this is a few years later, but at the same facility. The pageantry, again, incredible. The color, incredible. I wanted to get really close to these older women with all their color on, but I also wanted to incorporate these young girls in the foreground. So I planted myself directly in front of them and just kind of used the girls in the foreground to support the image. And when I framed it out, I looked at it and I said, wow, it makes a really nice image. But what else is important here are the colors, the stripes. The stripes decipher by clan. And each community up there deciphers itself by different colors. It's called Tiroklosti. I don't know the history of it, but that's what the Greeks identified it as, and that's what they're eating. And this is at another street festival. And as I said before, colors are part of the identity of the clans. These are the colors from Surmena. And again, at another street bazaar, I was walking around and I found this family that was selling these dolls out of the back of their cars, and I approached this little girl and I thought it was rather cool. Really interesting to capture her playing with dolls, and she's dressed up as a doll. Low-tech fun. I mean, how much fun can you have dressed like that? I mean, how much fun can you have by not using all the technology? This is how much fun. These kids are thoroughly enjoying themselves with these cards. You can't see it very well in this particular image because of the light, but the wood looked like it was cut down from the local trees, and it really spoke to the fact that kids can have so much fun today not using technology, and I thought it made a great image. And I'm bringing back this image. I hope it's going to come up the way I wanted to present it. I wanted to make a comparison and show the similarities between these girls who are Christian, and please come up, there you go, and these girls who are Muslim. One culture, 2 sets of photos that show the same, pretty much the same people, essentially what it is. These girls were waiting, I think, for the Archbishop to show up, and these girls were in this intense dance mood. As you can see, the jewelry is bouncing up. How can you not take a picture of this guy? He's the village mayor of Larakhani. When I first came to Pontus, I came with some friends that were descendants of this village, and this man spoke very good Pontian. And when we got there, one of the first things he kept telling me was how much he missed the Christian part of the community that was gone. So I shot his picture while he sat there and told us this story. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years later, and his son is now the village mayor. I went back there 5 years later. That table, that teapot, and that chair were still sitting out there. there. I thought it was remarkable that nothing had really changed. A little bit of humor here, but they say that in the Pontus region, it's like the Wild West. Every man carries a gun. I thought it was really peculiar that he was wearing a Western cowboy hat, and he kept wanting to show me his shooting skills, so he did. And as he turned away from the house where he was showing me, the fog was rolling, and it kind of made a humorous picture of the fog looking like smoke coming out of the gun. And this is the Turan family, and they live under the Monastery St. George Beristerotra. I apologize if I can't say it correctly, but this is where I lived for about a month. My driver's family lived right underneath this mountain. All the tourists that came through the woods to visit the monastery would have to come past their home. So just about 100 meters down the road, there was an abandoned house that I was living in. And every morning I'd walk down the dirt road, and my day would start with fresh vegetables, chicken, and they had trout, and sometimes we'd even grab one of the chickens off the roof. But for a month, this is where I lived. I didn't realize this was in here, but this is a relative. These are some of the relatives from that family, and the gentleman in the back worked in the city as a civil engineer, and he came through with a refrigerator that he was trying to take up to his house, but there was no trail, there was no road, and well, there is a trail, but there wasn't a road actually, and he was determined to get it up there. So I followed him around and the kids that were playing in the foreground as he marched it up. And he eventually made it up there on his back. I thought it was extraordinary. I think it spoke really to the ruggedness and the love of the land of these people and our people in general. A few days later, when I ran into him, he said he had to return the refrigerator because when he got back up, when he got it up there, he plugged it in and it didn't work. So this is a Pontian couple in Chaikara. One of my host families that I was staying with in downtown Trabzon took me out there to meet his family. And when I went out there, one of his friends that was from Greece was with us, and he was telling me the story about how important it is to preserve culture. And I read something about that, and the fact is that to preserve culture, quite often you have people intermarrying. And this couple had their first cousins, they were first cousins, they intermarried. So to preserve their culture and their language, they did what they did. And I didn't really talk to them about it, but I talked to the other guy, and they said this is a tradition that's kept in the region by a lot of people. We were invited to a wedding in Tanya. And Tanya is more of an isolated region to the west that we went into, and of course, when you're invited to a village wedding, everybody's invited to a village wedding. It's hard to see, but the bride and the mother-in-law are between the groom, and I thought this made a really interesting contrast of tradition and contemporary clothing. But the other part of this that was really funny to me, well, for me it was funny, she was a very unhappy bride. She didn't smile once during the whole day, and I think this really captured, it really caught the sense of the mood, and the mother-in-law was thrilled. As you can tell, she's dancing with the relatives. And on the way out of Tanya, we were driving back out to the city of Trabzon, and my driver said, look, there's a couple of boys with chickens, and I said, where? And he said, to the right, and we passed them, and we pulled over, he got out, and he immediately started talking to them in Pontian Greek. And as often as I've been up there, I still hear it, and I'm still astonished by it, but the fact that he got out and just casually started talking to them, I thought it was really neat. They said they were just going home because they had bought these chickens at a bazaar. So as they walked away from me, I turned with the camera and I caught this wonderful moment where the one boy actually, the chickens were in front of them. The one boy, for some reason, he put the one chicken behind him, and the other one turned to the left, so I caught this wonderful profile, and the light just kind of streaking through and lighting them up. I thought it made a really beautiful image of the region and spoke to the history of the people and how much tradition is still there. Plain and simple, a very beautiful woman. We were quite taken by her. I usually see women of a lot older looking. This is in Santa. We were on our way out to this cluster of villages that are deep on the one side of the region, and my driver pulled over and started talking to her, and she kind of had her head down, and when she looked up, she started to smile. And like I said before, most of the people that we run to are older looking that are doing this kind of work, and she's just a very young, beautiful woman. Okay, so why am I showing this? Because this is the traditional footwear that women are wearing. I don't know if you can see it, but for some reason when I got into something, I saw this stream and I saw this shoe, and I said, I have to have this picture. For me, it just left me wondering, you know, how did this shoe get here? A couple of years back, there was a Greek film crew working in the trap zone area. They were making a film called In the Footsteps of the Argonauts. And I thought this was kind of a funny image at the Monastery of Buddhism, where the film crew was filming. The actor was narrating in there. I think his name is Argonauts. He's a well-known Greek actor, and he was narrating part of the script. And they were trying to keep the rain off of the equipment. I thought it made a kind of a funny image of him, the director holding his cigarette far off to the left. And this is, of course, probably the main, or arguably the main reason why people come into the region. This is the Monastery of Buddhism. A little bit of an untraditional view here, but you get a sense of where this place is. It's very plush, it's on a mountain, and sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. I mean, this fog would roll in and suddenly you saw nothing, and then you could, suddenly it would pop up again. So, August the 14th, from about a few miles away from another mountain, looking up at that monastery again, I had asked my driver to take me to get a view of the monastery. I said, I really want to get a beautiful image of it. And so we crossed over and went up a dirt trail with the car, and at one point we had to leave the car because we couldn't go any further, and I climbed up on a few rocks, and I looked down and I said, I have this picture. I'll shoot it, but it's not exactly what I'm looking for. When I came back down, the military police showed up in a Jeep. They roughed up my driver and threw us in the back of the paddy wagon, and we spent the rest of the day in jail.
What did you do?
Apparently, the following day, which I'm kind of segueing into, was the day that the ecumenical patriarch was going to show up, and there was some security reasons they didn't want people anywhere in the area. That's what they told me. But what Tom mentioned earlier was when people come to the monastery, they're overwhelmed sometimes by what they see. And seeing it on the cliff, so high up above, and coming to it from a monk's path can be, it can be an exciting moment, it can be a thrilling moment, it can be something that's very memorable. And I specifically remember when I shot this picture, this woman was quite taken by the view, to the point that she wasn't paying attention. You can't see it here, but the wax is pouring down her hand, just burning her hand, but she was paying no attention to that. It's a very simple, pensive moment of the ecumenical patriarch, but to me it meant the world. I'll try and explain it real brief. On August the 15th, the first religious services at Buddhism were held after 88 years. On the 15th, you had people coming from all over the world. There was media presence from everywhere. There were gigantic screens at the base of the mountain for people to watch, where thousands had gathered. And on the outside paddock area of the monastery, people were piling in trying to get up and inside the monastery. Unfortunately, there were only 500 people allowed in with tickets. I got in and I worked my way to the front of the crowd and waited for the ecumenical patriarch, and as he walked up the steps in and then came down the steps into the bowels of the monastery, people started to quiet down. There was this wonderful moment of silence, and you heard the word axios, just bouncing off the walls. People started to yell it, and then everything went back into silence, and he went on with the religious service. For me, that was a climactic moment. 20 years of photographing the Pontian community, I got to experience something that was rather incredible and memorable. That specific moment to me signified the Pontian people's return to their homeland, and it announced to the world that here we are as a culture. And one final image. I'm going to have to read this one. I apologize, but this is Mavro Avramidis of Canton, Ohio. I wanted to close out with this final picture. She is responsible for many people, especially Pontians, for immigrating to America. Coincidentally, we came on a boat in 1965 called the Christopher Columbus with Miss Avramidis' help. In 2011, while attending a wedding in Canton, Ohio, after some 35 years, I got to finally meet her again and thank her for her service to our family. I often find myself reflecting on this image and am reminded of my personal journey and how tied to my life Pontian culture is. Today, I'm still fascinated by this incredible rich culture and in search of the next great moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted, for those wonderful photographs and for the talk. We're now going to hear Nikolaos Michailidis, who will talk both from his perspective as an anthropologist on Pontian culture and its survival in the Black Sea region, and on Pontian music, and he has his lyre here.
Thank you. Or will you simply prefer me playing the lyre instead of talking? It's an alternative too. So, from British English and American English, I will transfer you to Pontian Greek English. I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts as they get formulated while I'm writing my dissertation in Princeton right now. And I'm going to talk about some basic initial ideas about the renaissance of Pontian Greek culture, music and identity in contemporary Turkey, where I did my research. According to medieval historian Spiros Vrionis, the Turkish conquest of Asia Minor and the Islamization of the area's inhabitants since the 14th and 15th centuries constitute the last major stage in the history of Hellenism outside the Greek peninsula. Anatolian Hellenism, or the medieval Greek cultural element of Anatolia, was quantitatively and qualitatively significant during the Byzantine period. Thus, the Turkish conquest and Islamization of Asia Minor represents something more than a negative historical event, for the invaders had to subdue and absorb a vital community. The nature of the conquest, colonization and settlement caused major dislocation and destruction to Byzantine society. The gradual vanishing of a unified, relatively stable Byzantine administration, together with the rising Muslim hegemony, exercised a corrosive action upon the bonds and sentiments that held the Christian communities together, thus preparing the members for religious conversion. Though there is evidence for extensive conversion of Christians in the earlier period, as of the mid-13th century, the Christians of Anatolia still constituted a large bulk of the populace, perhaps even the majority. The political and historical events of the Turkish conquests in Asia Minor destroyed the Greek Church as an effective social, economic, and religious institution. Given the fact that religion permeated and formed practically every aspect of medieval society, the sharp decline of the Church was an unqualified disaster in the disappearance of the Byzantine character of Asia Minor or Anatolia. Christian society, which had been subjected to such disruption and dislocation in the wake of the Turkish invasions, was isolated from the heartbeat of its own culture in Constantinople and deprived of ecclesiastical leadership in the provinces. Thus, it was ripe for absorption into the new Islamic society. This was largely the work of Islamic institutions supported by the political and economic favor of the various Turkish principalities. These Muslim institutions, based securely on the economic possessions and revenues formerly belonging to the Christian Church, consummated the cultural transformation by converting the Christians to Islam. Professor Vrionis concludes that Byzantine culture in Anatolia, though effaced on the level of formal culture by Islam, exercised a determinant role in much of what was later called Turkish folk culture, in quotes. However, Islamization didn't bring Turkification immediately. Despite centuries of conversion and isolation, thousands of dialectic Greek speakers survived in various parts of Anatolia, and particularly in the Pontus region, on the eastern Black Sea shores of contemporary Turkey. These people, though Muslims and citizens of Turkey, call their language Romaica, and despite years of deliberate assimilation state policies, still have a very strong sense of local identity and a sense of difference that distinguishes them from the rest of the inhabitants of the country. Romaica is a local variation of Pontian Greek, a dialect of the Hellenic language that, though it underwent various changes, survived in Pontus for about 2,500 years and has reached our era. The dialect, as most Neo-Hellenic dialects, traces its roots to the common Hellenistic language, Hellenistiki Kimi, and it preserved features from ancient and medieval Greek. The speakers of this Greek dialect are the descendants of Orthodox Greeks who, for various reasons, were obliged to convert to Islam during the Ottoman period, mainly the 16th and 17th centuries. But they maintained their language up until our days. This case is quite similar to some Cretan and Cypriot Greek groups who also converted to Islam in Ottoman times, but still speak their local Greek dialects, together with contemporary Turkish, of course. All of them have become bilingual. Romaica, or Pontian Greek, is still spoken by many thousands of people, citizens of present-day Turkey, who inhabit the eastern Black Sea coast of the country, in communities around the ancient city of Trabzonda, Trabzon as they call it in Turkish, and their diasporas in Constantinople, in Smyrna, in Germany, in Holland, in Australia, in Belgium, in France, and in the United States. It is not an exaggeration to argue that these groups, together with their previous Orthodox Greek neighbors, are the descendants of the ancient Greek colonies in the region and of the Trabzon splinter state that was formed after the Fourth Crusade and survived until 1461, when Ottomans occupied the region and the process of gradual conversion to Islam started to take place. In Pontus, the rise and dominance of Islam occurred very slowly and was mainly the result of the deportation to Constantinople of the Greek intellectual and administrative elites, and of the conversion of a segment of the local Greek inhabitants and of their Christian neighbors, the Armenians and the Laz people. There was not a massive transfer of Muslim population to Pontus from elsewhere. Locals gradually became Muslims. This type of conversion to Islam also gave rise to the phenomenon of crypto-Christianity that is very well known in Pontus. And no matter how strange this might sound, the process of conversion produced a kind of Hellenized Islam, a peculiar syncretism that needs to be studied further. For instance, think about some of the indigenous Indian populations of the United States or the African Americans who converted to Christianity, and they still preserve many of the elements of their previous cultures. Imagine the equivalent of Greeks, converting to Islam. The phenomenon of syncretism is very fascinating and challenging for social scientists. Previous religious practices do not vanish suddenly. They can very well survive either through their investment with new meanings within the context of the new religion, or as meaningless folklore, in quotes, of a previous stage of the group's life. For example, in many Romaica-speaking Muslim communities in Turkey, today, the deceased person is buried with the coffin. This is a remnant of their Orthodox past, and it is strictly prohibited in Islam. Despite this de facto prohibition, the locals still maintain it as a custom of our ancestors, as they say, without knowing much detail about its significance and symbolism. The lament, or miroloi, as we call it, for the deceased person is also something not accepted in Islam, but still practiced by many of the Romaica speakers today in Trabzon. With the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, Orthodox Christians, at least those who survived from the genocidal policies of the Young Turks regime, had to live and relocate in mainland Greece, whereas Pontian Greek speakers who converted to Islam remained in their historical lands and were subjected to a policy of Turkification through educational indoctrination and penal disciplining. Muslims, regardless of their ideas of themselves and their ethnic identities and language, were turned into Turks, and since then any deviation would not be tolerated by the nationalist regime. All these events of that period are currently being re-evaluated and discussed among younger generations of scholars and democratic activists in Turkey, beyond the official explanations and narratives provided so far. This is a positive sign that comes from within civil society in Turkey. Moreover, the presence in today's Pontos of thousands of Pontian Greek speakers constitutes a historical paradox that challenges researchers and thinkers. Despite years of assimilation policies, marginalization, and stigmatization of their dialect, the younger generations seem more willing to reappropriate their linguistic treasures and move away from the fears of their ancestors. A number of young writers, cinematographers, historians, musicians, and activists play a key role in this process, despite the negative reactions by various segments of the state and society. Productions of films that deal openly with the issue of conversion, articles, books, CDs, festivals are some of the activities currently taking place in the region. Music is central in this revival process, as it was central in the assimilation policies of the Kemalist state since the foundation of modern Turkey in 1923. What is today called Turkish folk music, in quotes, is, to a great degree, a compilation of songs that were sung by all the different indigenous groups of Pontus and Asia Minor in their native languages: Greek, Armenian, Kurdish, Arabic, Circassian, Assyrian, and many more. With the decision and order of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the so-called founder of modern Turkey, the lyrics of many of these songs were changed into Turkish and could hence be presented as Turkish folk music. The Pontian Greek lyra, still performed by the Muslim Pontian Greek speakers, went through a stigmatization and marginalization process that threatened this musical culture and the instrument with extinction. Muslim preachers in the past would discourage people from listening to the lyra because, as they were saying, the lyra was the instrument of the infidels that was leading to alcohol consumption. However, despite the unfavorable conditions, the art of Pontian lyra performance among the Muslims survived, and even a revival is currently underway. Until the 1990s, it was prohibited in Turkey to record and release a CD with non-Turkish indigenous lyrics. You could find a cassette or a CD with English, Spanish, or French lyrics, but not with Pontian Greek, Armenian, Arabic, Kurdish, etc. These had to be erased from the collective and individual memories of the citizens, but it was not easy to succeed. Melodies are stubborn, and they can survive in the hearts and mouths of people for long periods of time. After years of political and intellectual struggles, the ban on lyrics was officially lifted in the 1990s. A new generation of performers have tentatively started recording CDs in Pontian Greek, thus gradually creating audiences with interest in this music and this language. The work of these musicians is slowly contributing to the rise of the awareness of this ancient Greek culture that is still alive in modern Anatolia, and to the gradual realization and appreciation of the multi-ethnic background of Turkey. And for those of us who are familiar with the political realities of this country, we know that this is a very complicated process faced with serious obstacles. More generally, music making and listening in historical and socio-cultural contexts such as that of Turkey is a politically sensitive field of human activity, because music it is a bearer of memory, emotion and ideas that are crucial for the way a group of individuals identifies. The issues of religion, of language, history, music and identity are strongly debated among the youth in contemporary Trabzon. Official narratives about the roots of the inhabitants of this region do not seem to offer convincing explanations to everyone. Many people in Turkey are in search of what they call roots. Ayşe, one of my informants during my research in this area in Trabzon, is one among those who are searching for their identity, as she put it to me. Though she would identify as a Turk initially, Ayşe was confused by the fact that her grandmother, as she remembers, had a great love for Virgin Mary and a respect for everything Christian. and that her grandmother's Turkish, were mixed with Pontian Greek words. And she also had a very strange accent that didn't sound really Turkish, as she would say. Discussions during family gatherings about who they are and whether they were real Turks or Greeks or whatever would never end. After years of doubting, thinking, researching and reading books, Ayşe decided to convert to Orthodox Christianity because, as she claimed, by doing so, she was feeling that she was returning to the religion of her ancestors. She was baptized 2 years ago and took the symbolic name of Soumela. It's very famous among Pontian Greeks, from the well-known Greek Orthodox monastery in Trebizond. Ayşe, or Soumela with her new name, still lives in this small provincial city of Pontus, and she complains for not having a functioning Orthodox church there that would serve the rising community of the new converts, most of them young, educated university students who decided to convert for the same reasons like Ayşe. All of these young people are coming from families that are Pontian Greek speakers and quite faithful Muslims. We are faced with a fascinating phenomenon. After centuries of conversions to Islam and assimilation policies since the collapse of Byzantium in the 15th century, the quest for roots and identity among many citizens of contemporary Turkey constitutes a challenging historical paradox and an enigma for all of us who study human societies in the present, their evolution in time, and their thirst for faith and belonging. This might be the beginning of the gradual renaissance of the Hellenic culture in contemporary Pontus, and it will certainly contribute to the making of an atmosphere of mutual understanding and peaceful coexistence in Anatolia between groups of different backgrounds and cultures. Thank you very much. It's time for the lira to speak now. Perform two songs that were written by a very close friend of mine who was born and raised in Kapezun, and his name is Athenic. His native language is Pontian Greek. He's a very good lira player and singer, and he's becoming quite famous in Turkey right now. We met around 12 years ago, and we started playing together, and we've recorded a few CDs together, and our last CD is currently in circulation in Turkey, and we gave the symbolic name of bridge from Thessaloniki to Trabzon. It's a cooperation of Greek and other Trabzonian performers. Do we need this or?
Yes, and the other Greek.
So the first song is about nostalgia for the homeland, for the village, for the mountains, etc. And the name is Egomothane to Mater, which means, how we translate this?
My
eyes are full of tears.
καρδιά εις όλον τον κόσμο να λέω.
χωρίον τα παρχάρια άξανα έρθαν σακουλή. Ερωθεί μέσα την μάνα τα ρασία και τον Κύρι. Ερωθεί μέσα την μάνα τα ρασία και τον Κύρι. Καρδιά σήμη πορτάει, εσπαλεί ένας ατερτιάει. Την καρδιά σήμη πορτάει, εκλειδώθενας ατερτιάει. Αμον γύρευος ψαλάφο, ξένους ανθρώπους συμπορτά. Αμον γύρευος ψαλάφο, ξένους ανθρώπους συμπορτά. Το χωρίον τα παρχάρια άξανα έρθαν σακουλή. Ερωθεί μέσα τη μάνα τα ρασία και τον Κύρι. Ερωθεί μέσα τη μάνα τα ρασία και τον Κύρι. Έλα στα επορπατεσάι, χωριά και με μλεκέτια. Έλα στα επορπατεσάι, χωριά και με μλεκέτια. Άμονες ένα πακίδαί, στον κόσμο τραπέζουντα. Άμονες ένα πακίδαί, στον κόσμο τραπέζουντα. Το χωρίον τα παρχάρια άξανα έρθαν σακουλή. Ερωθεί μέσα τη μάνα τα ρασία και τον Κύρι. Αν ποθάνοητη παιδεία φέρειτε μέσα ρασία, αν χαμέητη παιδεία φέρειτε μέσα ρασία, ναι νερό θέλω νεφαΐν, σώνουνε με τα πουλία. Ναι νερό θέλω νεφαΐν, σώνουνε με τα πουλία. Το χωρίον τα παρχάρια άξανα έρθαν σακουλή. Ερωθεί μέσα τη μάνα τα ρασία και τον Κύρι. Ερωθεί μέσα τη μάνα τα ρασία και τον Κύρι. Τα ρασία και τον Κύρι. So this was the melody and the lyrics were written by Adem, who is 32 years old, I think now, he's still young. And he wrote it while he was living in Constantinople, away from his mother and his father, who were living in the village most of the time. And then he decided to get married and go back to his village, and now he lives in Trabzon again. And because he was singing in Pontian Greek in some festivals, etc., and he was very often coming to Greece to perform with us, he faced many difficulties from the authorities. He was indirectly threatened and told that he will never be able to survive as a professional musician in this country if he continues singing in this dialect. But he kept up, and now he gained the acceptance of larger audiences, and we are happy for that, because with that the Pontian Greek dialect is getting more acceptance by mainstream Turkish society, and this is very, very important. And the last song I'm going to share with you, again written by Adem, the melody and the lyrics, Επέγναμ Σαπαρχάρια, we were going to the highlands. It's a song written about his mother and his memories with his mother going to the village, going to the highlands, etc. The previous one lasts for about 12 minutes. I performed the short version.
Very welcome, and of course you'll have an opportunity to speak to the speakers afterwards. But now, the lady in the front here, yeah.
You know, for Nikos, I'm wondering two things, two questions, please. I'm wondering if the people that are or rather converting back to Christianity, if they're being hassled, because it's really a big crime to leave Islam. And the other question is there a difference between the music in the Pontic music in the highlands and in the coastland? Is somehow when you were playing, I have these visions of mountain things. I don't know if they're just projecting or whether it's part of the music.
No, you're not projecting actually. Regarding your first question about conversion, it is a very small community right now, about 50 people maybe. Most of them, as I said, university graduates who come from Pontic Greek-speaking communities, and they generally avoid stating publicly that they have converted to Christianity because Trabzon is a very small and extremely conservative society. There is one among them who is quite, passionate about that, and he wants to become a priest. And he's wearing his cross and walking around. He has been attacked by extreme nationalist groups there in the city, but he didn't do something illegal. I mean, it's not prohibited by law to change your religion. You can be an atheist if you like, right? There is no law saying that you can't change your religion. Of course, there is a lot of social harassment. That's the problem. So, but in terms of legal prohibitions, no, as far as I know. But generally people just avoid saying that, and they try. Some of them have moved to Constantinople and they live there, which is a major urban center, and nobody knows anybody. So it's easier to live there. And regarding the second question, it's very interesting because yes, the lira is it constitutes part of the musical culture that comes from rural areas on the mountains. There used to be lira performance around the cities by the sea, but due to assimilation policy and the rise of conversion, this instrument was really stigmatized, as I mentioned earlier, and it was not easy in the city to play. So many performers were also not well regarded. They were extremely stigmatized, and they were considered the losers of the society. To be the lira player meant that you didn't have something else to do. You ended up playing the lira. And nobody wanted to marry his daughter with a lira player. I remember Adem, during my research there, because we were living together, telling me that even his father, who was a preacher, he was an imam, a Muslim preacher, he didn't want Adem to play the lira. And so Adem had to hide his lira somewhere in the house, and his mother was protecting him, telling him that, your father is about to come, stop playing. And sometimes he would take the lira and go to the forest, where nobody could listen to him, and start playing there. But after a few years, he realized that, Adem is dedicated to this instrument, and he just accepted it. But it's not easy for a faithful Muslim to accept this musical instrument, and especially your son playing, it used to be a stigma, and it still is a stigma to a certain degree. It's very interesting. Some performers were telling me that they have regretted for recording cassettes, though this is not written anywhere in any Islamic text. Again, local Muslim preachers were telling them that it is a sin to play the music and record cassettes, because after they pass away, people will continue listening to the music. They will suffer in the other world. And this was a very effective tool that made many performers not to record any cassettes, and many melodies have been lost like that. We know nothing about it. It was a very clever and very successful tool that was implemented in that particular locality. And this happened not only with the lira, but with other instruments of different indigenous groups. And the lira was replaced by the baglama, a lute, call it sad, which is considered to be the Turkish national folk instrument, and many Pontian melodies were performed by that. It is as if saying in Greece that, we won't have any Pontian or Cretan or any kinds of lyrics, we will play Cretan, Thracian, Macedonian, whatever music with a bouzouki. Can you imagine what kind of sonic homogenization and disaster this might be? This actually happened in Turkey. But now this is collapsing, and the lira is coming back, together with other local instruments, and with local cultures and languages. That's why music was strictly regulated in Turkey and controlled.
Is mountain music?
Excuse Excuse me?
mountain music?
Yes, because it was produced mainly by people who were living in, in small communities. And if you examine the themes, if you analyze the themes of the song, they mainly talk about the nature, about ships, about living in the village, etc. There is no urban experience there.
Gentleman at the back.
When did they start playing the lira? How old is it? You know?
Well, I really don't know, because we don't have a serious academic study, a monograph that describes the history of this instrument, as we have for other instruments, for example. My hypothesis is that it dates back to at least the Empire of Trabzon, and we need to examine that. We don't have some archival material right now that would tell us that, this instrument was created at that period of time. Though it is a very interesting question, I'm also curious. But this is not what I'm studying right now. It's something different. Yes?
Is it possible to buy recorded Pontian Greek music today? And if so, where, how, where would you look it up?
You mean in Turkey?
Well, even in the United States.
Or the United States? The United States, I really don't know.
But how about in Turkey?
In Turkey, well, there are some places in Constantinople and some local stores in Trabzon right now that started selling. They sell our CDs, for example, as far as I know.
Are there websites?
And in Greece, of course, there are many places, mainly Thessaloniki and
Are there
others.
websites that...
There are some websites,
Okay,
yes,
okay.
yes. You can order online too. But there are so much music on YouTube,
Right.
We can share it with you for free if you want.
Right.
Any other questions? Take a last question from the back now. Yeah.
Well, are there any Pontian Greeks left in any of the countries that you're responsible for? In the sense that...
There are a very few in Abkhazia. They were evacuated during the war by this operation called Operation Golden Fleece, which took many of them to Greece. It was organised by the Greek government in the middle of the Georgian-Abkhaz war. And literally people cut photos from their family albums, walked onto a ship and had them stuck into Greek passports. And obviously that one can understand why that happened during the war, but it's rather sad the war ended a few months later and basically the Greek community had pretty much disappeared. So I had very mixed feelings about that. There are still Greeks in Georgia. Many of them have gone to Greece. Some of them are seasonal workers. Very few in Azerbaijan. There's a small Greek community left in Baku. But still quite a lot in Russia and in Ukraine as well. But the Caucasus, sadly, economic collapse meant that, and the lure of emigration to Greece has really emptied out those Pontic communities in the Caucasus.
But I have heard that there are a number of prominent Greeks, or at least former Pontians, who have achieved high positions in Russian society.
That's right. There was the former mayor of Moscow, Gabriel Popov, was a Greek, and then there's a current Russian member of parliament, Savigi, who I think Nikos was saying has just bought which football team? Bauer. So yeah, there are some influential Russian Greeks.
I think the lady over there had a question.
It was a question for Nikos. I heard that you mentioned the gradual Islamization of the Pontus region, and from what I was hearing, generally speaking, it was a family-by-family decision. I have heard that the village of Sanda, it was a group decision for the village for half the village to convert in order to increase their general influence in the region. Have you heard of any other villages where that was the case? This is pre-1923, obviously.
Yeah,
This occurred about 1850.
Yes, well, I'm not an Ottoman historian, but I like to look at the sources, and there are some very interesting academic works on this topic. There were families that converted to Islam for political reasons. but also for economic reasons, because they would avoid many of the taxes. It would be a privilege to become a Muslim, you see. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, we have many stories of families who just didn't want to abandon their native land and move elsewhere to Greece or wherever. So they moved from their original villages, from their original communities, and they traveled few miles westwards, for example, and they settled in a new community, and they declared themselves as Muslims, though they weren't. And we know today the descendants of these families, many of them are communists, they are atheists, they don't go to mosques. There are many stories like this, there are many families like this. Yes. But mainly economic reasons, I would say. Economic reasons that are related to political reasons, of course, but that's a very different discussion.
Very quick question. You mentioned something about crypto-Christians. And I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that.
Well, from the sources we know that crypto-Christianity is a phenomenon that was revealed in the 19th century, in 1850s, if I remember correctly, where many families from the Kromni region of the Argyroupoli, after the Happy Humayun and the so-called liberalization of the Ottoman regime, decided to declare their Orthodox faith. And it is well known that they were living as Muslims, they had Muslim names, etc. They were performing all the Muslim rituals, etc. But at the same time, they were Christians, they had priests, they had Christian names, etc. And what is very fascinating for me is that currently this issue is somehow debated in Turkey. And recently there was a film, I think 2 years ago, produced by an intellectual and a filmmaker from the Rize region of Pontus, who deals particularly with the issue of conversion. It tells the story of two young people who fall in love. The name of the film is Ask Your Heart or Your Soul. You can check it on YouTube if you have time, with Greek subtitles too, or English.
I was asking
Yeah.
contemporary.
About contemporary, I can't know that, to be honest, because it is crypto-Christianity, so it's not revealed. But there are rumors that there are still families in the Trabzon region that maintain their faith, etc. But they are really afraid of that. But we don't know. We don't have any numbers or official information.
I can respond a little bit to that
Yes.
query, because 11 years ago when I went to the Patriarchate after becoming a bishop, we went out with one of the metropolitans from the Patriarchate who was telling me about a visit he had made to Banaya Sumela. And some of the nuns at the monastery had asked him to bring back a rock from Banaya Sumela as kind of a leapstone or a memento. And he bent down and picked the rock up and put it in his pocket, and there was a soldier there who hit him with the butt of his gun and said to him in Turkish, "Are you a priest?" Because he figured with the black suit and the black tights anyway. And he said yes, and he thought he was in trouble now. And this Turkish soldier said to him, "My Turkish name is Ahmet, but I was baptized," and he gave his Christian name. So we have instances of like that, which confirm the existence of, we don't know how many, but...
During my presence there and my research there, I met with people who claim that, they come from Orthodox Christian families. They became Muslims and they stayed there, but people are not very willing to discuss about these issues, especially with Greeks coming from Greece.
We will take two final questions, one from the gentleman here and one from Irish Christodoulou, and then we'll break.
May I add something to the previous comment? I think what is really important is the fact that this issue is currently being discussed among intellectuals, democratic intellectuals mainly. And they have opened this discussion, and this is something very positive, I think. The rest is an issue of the church and God. We can know.
Gentleman here.
It's more of an announcement, if anyone would be interested, more or less, that to acquire some of the culture and music of the Pontians. I am part of the New York Community Society, which is the Pontian group in New York City. And we do have dances. One is coming up on February 23rd, and someone would be interested interested to experience the music and some culture of the Pontian Greeks. It was very well to see me and information.
After that'd be great. Thanks.
A quick question. Tom, you mentioned the exchange of populations by the Treaty of Lausanne in 23. And my understanding, you mentioned is 1 million Greeks went and 500,000 Muslims went back. But my understanding is that most of the Greeks left, but only half of the Muslims in Greece went back. In other words, there was an equal number that remained, another 500,000 perhaps, maybe that's the present figure. I'm not sure what the figure was then. I wonder if I could be corrected. My question is, what were the characteristics of these two groups of Muslims? Was there any economic reason why you chose to leave? Was it an ideological reason? What was the characteristic of one group versus the other that remained in Greece?
I'm sure there are people here who have a better answer to this question than I do, but as I understand it, in Muslims of Thrace were exempted, which means that was the big exemption, and obviously the Greeks of Constantinople were also exempted. So I think it was diplomatic bargaining, and you read these heartrending accounts of these Cretan Muslims saying, "We'll convert, we'll do anything, we want to stay in our homeland," and being rejected because their category had already been decided for them, and similarly, obviously, with many people in the Pontus.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, Ted, and Nikos, for really a fantastic